The Awakening, the Resurrection, Leo Tolstoy, the conclusion to the entire book. Chapter 88. An officer entered the cell and announced that the time for departing had arrived. He counted every prisoner, pointing at everyone with his finger. When he reached Nekhlyudov, he said familiarly, "It is too late to remain now, Prince. It is time to go." Nekhlyudov, knowing what that meant, approached him and thrust 3 rubles into his hand. "Nothing can be done with you. Stay here a while longer." Simonson, who was all the while silently sitting on his bunk, his hands clasped behind his head, firmly arose, and carefully making his way through those sitting around the bunk, went over to Nekhlyudov. "Can you hear me now?" asked Simonson. "Certainly," said Nekhlyudov, also rising to follow him. Maslova saw Nekhlyudov rising, and their eyes meeting. She turned red in the face, and doubtfully, as it seemed, shook her head. "My business with you is the following," began Simonson, when they reached the corridor. "Knowing your relations toward Catherine Mikhailovna," and he looked straight into Nekhlyudov's face, "I consider it my duty." But at the very door, 2 voices were shouting at the same time. "I tell you, heathen, they are not mine," shouted one voice. "Choke yourself, you devil," the other said hoarsely. At that moment, Maria Pavlovna entered the corridor. "You cannot talk here," she said. "Walk in here. Only Verochka is there." And she opened the door of a tiny cell, evidently intended for solitary confinement, and now at the disposal of the political prisoners. On one of the bunks lay Vera Efremovna, with her head covered. "She is ill and asleep. She cannot hear you, and I will go," said Maria Pavlovna. "On the contrary, stay here," said Simonson. "I keep nothing secret, especially from you." "Very well," said Maria Pavlovna, and childishly moving her whole body from side to side, and thus getting into a snug corner of the bunks, she prepared to listen, at the same time looking somewhere in the distance with her beautiful sheepish eyes. "Well, then, knowing your relations toward Catherine Mikhailovna, I consider it my duty to let you know my relations to her." "Well, go on," said Nekhlyudov, involuntarily admiring Simonson's simplicity and straightforwardness. "I wish to tell you that I would like to marry Catherine Mikhailovna." "Remarkable," exclaimed Maria Pavlovna, fixing her gaze on Simonson. "And I've decided to ask her to be my wife," continued Simonson. "What, then, can I do?" "It depends on her," said Nekhlyudov. "Yes, but she would not decide the matter without you." "Why?" "Because, while the question of your relations remains undecided, she cannot choose. On my part, the question is definitely decided. I only wished to do that which I considered it my duty to do, and also to relieve her condition, but in no case did I intend to influence her choice." "Yes, but she does not wish your sacrifice." "There is no sacrifice." "And I also know that her decision is irrevocable." "Why, then, talk to me," said Nekhlyudov. "It is necessary for her that you should also approve of it." "I can only say that I am not free, but she is free to do what she wishes." Simonson began to ponder. "Very well, I will tell her so. Do not think that I am in love with her," he continued. "I admire her as a good, rare person who has suffered much. I wish nothing from her, but I would very much like to help her, to relieve her." Simonson's trembling voice surprised Nekhlyudov. "To relieve her condition," continued Simonson. "If she does not wish to accept your help, let her accept mine. If she consented, I would ask permission to join her in prison. 4 years is not an eternity. I would live near her and perhaps lighten her fate." His emotion again compelled him to stop. "What can I say?" said Nekhlyudov. "I am glad that she has found such a protector." "That is just what I wanted to know," continued Simonson. "I wish to know whether you, loving her and seeking her good, could approve of her marrying me." "Oh, yes," Nekhlyudov answered decisively. "It is all for her. All I wish is that that woman who had suffered so much should have some rest, said Simonson, with a childlike gentleness that no one would expect from a man of such gloomy aspect. Simonson rose, took Nekhlyudov's hand, smiled bashfully, and embraced him. "Well, I will so tell her," he said, and left the room. Chapter 89. "What do you think of him?" said Maria Pavlovna. "In love, and earnestly in love. I never thought that Vladimir Simonson could fall in love in such a very stupid, childish fashion. It is remarkable, and to tell the truth, sad," she concluded, sighing. "But Katya? How do you think she will take it?" asked Nekhlyudov. "She?" Maria Pavlovna stopped, evidently desiring to give a precise answer. "She. You see, notwithstanding her past, she is naturally of a most moral character, and her feelings are so refined. She loves you, very much so, and is happy to be able to do you the negative good of not binding you to herself. Marriage with you would be a dreadful fall to her, worse than all her past. For this reason, she would never consent to it. At the same time, your presence perplexes her." "Ought I then to disappear?" asked Nekhlyudov. Maria Pavlovna smiled in her pleasant, childish way. "Yes, partly." "How can I partly disappear?" "I take it back, but I will tell you that she probably sees the absurdity of that exalted love of his, he has not spoken to her about it, is flattered by it, and fears it. You know that I am not competent in these matters, but I think that his love is that of the ordinary man, although it is masked. He says that it rouses his energy, and that it is a platonic love, but it has nothing but nastiness for its basis." "But what am I to do?" asked Nekhlyudov. "I think it is best that you have a talk with her. It is always better to make everything clear. Shall I call her?" said Maria Pavlovna. "If you please," answered Nekhlyudov, and Maria Pavlovna went out. Nekhlyudov was seized with a strange feeling when, alone in the small cell, he listened to the quiet breathing of Vera Efremovna, interrupted by an occasional moan and the constant din coming from the cells of the convicts. That which Simonson had told him freed him from his self-imposed obligation, which, in a moment of weakness, seemed to him burdensome and dreadful. And yet it was not only unpleasant, but painful. The offer of Simonson destroyed the exclusiveness of his act, minimized in his own and other people's eyes the value of the sacrifice he was making. If such a good man as Simonson, who was under no obligation to her, wished to join his fate to hers, then his own sacrifice was no longer so important. Maybe there was also the ordinary feeling of jealousy. He was so used to her love that he could not think that she was capable of loving anyone else. Besides, his plans were now shattered, especially the plan of living near her while she served her sentence. If she married Simonson, his presence was no longer necessary, and that required a rearrangement of his projects. He could scarcely collect his thoughts when Katyusha entered the cell. With quick steps she approached him. "Maria Pavlovna sent me," she said, stopping near him. "Yes, I would like to talk with you. Take a seat. Vladimir Ivanovitch spoke to me." She seated herself, crossed her hands on her knees, and seemed calm. But as soon as Nekhlyudov pronounced Simonson's name, her face turned a purple color. "What did he tell you?" she asked. "He told me that he wishes to marry you." Her face suddenly became wrinkled, evidencing suffering, but she remained silent, only looking at the floor. "He asked my consent or advice. I told him that it all rests with you, that you must decide." "Oh, what is it all for?" she said, and looked at Nekhlyudov with that squinting glance that always peculiarly affected him. For a few seconds they looked silently at each other. That glance was significant to both. "You must decide," repeated Nekhlyudov. "Decide what?" she said. "It has all been decided long ago. It is you who must decide whether you will accept the offer of Vladimir Ivanovitch," she continued, frowning. "But if a pardon should come?" said Nekhlyudov. "Oh, leave me alone. It is useless to talk any more," she answered, and rising, left the cell. Gaining the street, Nekhlyudov stopped, and expanding his chest, drew in the frosty air. The following morning, a soldier brought him a note from Maria Pavlovna in which she said that Kriltsov's condition was worse than they thought it to be. At one time we intended to remain here with him, but they would not allow it. So we are taking him with us, but we fear the worst. Try to so arrange in town that if he is left behind, some one of us shall remain with him. If it is necessary for that purpose that I should marry him, then of course I am ready to do it. Nekhlyudov obtained horses and hastened to catch up with the party of prisoners. He stopped his team near the wagon, carrying Kriltsov on a bed of hay and pillows. Beside Kriltsov sat Maria Pavlovna. Kriltsov, in a fur coat and lambskin cap, seemed thinner and more pale than before. His beautiful eyes seemed particularly larger and sparkling. Weakly rolling from side to side from the jostling of the wagon, he steadily looked at Nekhlyudov, and in answer to questions about his health, he only closed his eyes and angrily shook his head. It required all his energy to withstand the jostling of the wagon. Maria Pavlovna exchanged glances with Nekhlyudov, expressing apprehension concerning Kriltsov's condition. "The officer seems to have some shame in him," she shouted, so as to be heard above the rattling of the wheels. He removed the handcuffs from Buzovkin, who is now carrying his child. With him are Katya, Simonson, and in my place, Verochka. Kriltsov, pointing at Maria Pavlovna, said something which could not, however, be heard. Nekhlyudov leaned over him in order to hear him. Then Kriltsov removed the handkerchief, which was tied around his mouth, and whispered, "Now I am better. If I could only keep from catching cold." Nekhlyudov nodded affirmatively and glanced at Maria Pavlovna. "Have you received my note, and will you do it?" asked Maria Pavlovna. "Without fail," said Nekhlyudov, and seeing the dissatisfied face of Kriltsov, went over to his own team, climbed into the wagon, and holding fast to the sides of it, drove along the line of grey-coated and fettered prisoners which stretched for almost a mile. Nekhlyudov crossed the river to a town, and his driver took him to a hotel where, notwithstanding the poor appointments, he found a measure of comfort entirely wanting in the inns of his stopping places. He took a bath, dressed himself in city clothes, and drove to the governor of the district. He alighted at a large, handsome building, in front of which stood a sentry and a policeman. The general was ill and did not receive. Nekhlyudov, nevertheless, asked the porter to take his card to the general, and the porter returned with a favorable answer. "You are asked to step in." The vestibule, the porter, the messenger, the shining floor of the hall, everything reminded him of St. Petersburg, only it was somewhat dirtier and more majestic. Nekhlyudov was admitted to the cabinet. The general, bloated, with a potato nose and prominent bumps on his forehead, hairless pate and bags under his eyes, a man of sanguine temperament, was reclining in a silk morning gown, and with a cigarette in his hand was drinking tea from a silver saucer. "How do you do, sir? Excuse my receiving you in a morning gown. It is better than not receiving at all," he said, covering his stout, wrinkled neck with the collar of his gown. "I am not quite well, and do not go out. What brought you into these wilds?" "I was following a party of convicts, among whom is a person near to me," said Nekhlyudov. "And now I come to see your excellency about that person, and also another affair." The general inhaled the smoke of his cigarette, took a sip of tea, placed his cigarette in a malachite ash holder, and steadily gazing with his watery, shining eyes at Nekhlyudov, listened gravely. He only interrupted Nekhlyudov to ask him if he wished to smoke. Nekhlyudov told the general that the person in whom he was interested was a woman, that she was unjustly convicted, and that His Majesty's clemency had been appealed to. "Yes, well," said the general, "I was promised in St. Petersburg that the news of this woman's fate would be sent to this place not later than this month." Looking steadily at Nekhlyudov, the general asked, "Anything else?" "My second request would be concerning the political prisoner who is going to Siberia with this detachment." "Is that so?" said the general. "He is very sick. He is a dying man." and he will probably be left here in the hospital. For this reason, one of the female prisoners would like to remain with him. Is she a relative of his? No, but she wishes to marry him, if it will allow her to stay with him. The general looked sharply at Nekhlyudov from his shining eyes, and smoking continually, he kept silence, as if wishing to confound his companion. When Nekhlyudov had finished, he took a book from the table, and frequently wetting the fingers with which he turned the leaves, he lighted on the chapter treating of marriage and perused it. "What's her sentence?" he asked, lifting his eyes from the book. "Hers? Hard labor. If this is the case, the sentence cannot be changed by marriage." "But, I beg your pardon, if a free man would marry her, she would have to serve her sentence all the same. Whose sentence is harder, his or hers?" "Both are sentenced to hard labor." "So they are quits," the general said, laughing. "An equal share for both of them. He may be left here on account of his sickness," he continued, "and of course everything will be done to ameliorate his condition, but she, even if she should marry him, cannot remain here. Anyhow, I will think it over. What are their names? Write them down here." Nekhlyudov did as he was asked. "And this I cannot do either," said the general, concerning his request to see the patient. "Of course I don't suspect you, but you are interested in them and in others. You have money, and the people here are corrupt. How, then, is it possible for me to watch a person who is 5,000 miles distant from me? There he is king, as I am here," and he began to laugh. "You have surely seen the political prisoners. You have surely given them money," he added, smiling. "Isn't it so?" "Yes, it is true." "I understand that you must act in this way. You want to see the political prisoner, and you all sorrow for him, and the soldier on guard will surely take money because he has a family, and his salary amounts to something less than nothing. He cannot afford to refuse. I would do the same were I in yours or his place. But being situated as I am now, I cannot permit myself to disobey one iota of the law, for the very reason that I, too, am no more than a man, and am liable to yield to pity. They confide in me under certain conditions, and I, by my actions, must prove that I am trustworthy. So this question is settled. Well, now tell me what is going on at the metropolis." Then the general put various questions, as if he would like to learn some news. "Well, tell me now whom you are stopping with. At Duke's? It is unpleasant there. Come to us to dinner," he said, finally, dismissing Nekhlyudov. "At 5. Do you speak English?" "Yes, sir." "Well, that is good. You see, there is an English traveller here. He is studying the exile system and the prisons in Siberia, so he will dine with us, and you come too. We dine at 5, and Madam wants us to be punctual. I will let you know what will be done with that woman, and also with the patient. Maybe it will be possible to leave somebody with him." Having taken leave of the general, Nekhlyudov drove to the post office. Receiving his mail, he walked up to a wooden bench on which a soldier was sitting, probably waiting for something. He sat down beside him and started to look through the letters. Among them he found a registered letter in a beautiful large envelope with a large seal of red wax on it. He tore open the envelope, and seeing a letter from Selenin with some official document, he felt the blood mounting to his cheeks and his heart grow weak. This document was the decision concerning Katyusha's trial. What was it? Was it possible that it contained a refusal? Nekhlyudov hastily ran over the letter, written in small, hardly legible, broken handwriting, and breathed freely. The decision was a favorable one. "Dear friend," wrote Selenin, "our last conversation made a strong impression upon me. You were right concerning Maslova. I have looked through the accusation. This could be corrected only through the Commission for Petitions to which you sent your petition. They let me have a copy of the pardon, and here I send it to you, to the address which the Countess Catherine Ivanovna gave me. I press your hand in friendship." The news was pleasant and important. All that Nekhlyudov could wish for Katyusha and himself was realized. True, those changes in his life changed his relations to her. But now, he thought, All that was most important was to see her as quick as possible and bring her the good news of her freedom. He thought that the copy he had in his hand was sufficient for that. So he bade the cabman drive at once to the prison. The superintendent of the prison told him that he could not admit him without a permit from the general. The copy of the petition from their Majesty's bureau also did not prevail with the superintendent. He positively refused admittance. He also refused to admit him to see Kryltsov. Chapter 90. After the disappointment at the prison, Nekhlyudov drove down to the governor's bureau to find out whether they had received there any news concerning the pardon of Maslova. There was no news there, so he drove back to his hotel and wrote at once to the lawyer and to Selenin concerning it. Having finished the letters, he glanced at his watch. It was already time to go to the general. On the way, he thought again of how he might hand over the pardon to Katyusha, of the place she would be sent to, and how he would live with her. At dinner in the general's house, all were not only very friendly to Nekhlyudov, but as it seemed, very favorably inclined to him, as he was a new, interesting personality. The general, who came into dinner with a white cross on his breast, greeted Nekhlyudov like an old friend. On the general's inquiry as to what he had done since he saw him in the morning, Nekhlyudov answered that he had been at the post office, that he had found out the facts concerning the pardoning of the person they were talking of in the morning, and he asked permission to visit her. The general seemed displeased, began to frown, and said nothing. "Will you have some whiskey?" he said in French to the Englishman who had walked up to him. The Englishman took some and related that he had been to see the cathedral of the city and the factory, and expressed the desire to see the great jail in which criminals were confined on their way to Siberia. "This idea is excellent," exclaimed the general, turning to Nekhlyudov. "You may go together. Give them a pass," he added, turning to his lieutenant. "What time do you wish to go?" Nekhlyudov asked the Englishman. "I prefer to visit prisons in the evening," the Englishman replied. "All are then at home, and there are no preparations." After dinner, Nekhlyudov followed her into the antechamber, where the Englishman was already waiting for him to visit the prison, as they had agreed. Having taken leave of the whole family, he walked out, followed by the Englishman. The sombre-looking prison, the soldier on guard, the lantern behind the gate, notwithstanding the pure white layer of snow which had covered everything, the sidewalk, the roof, and the walls made a gloomy impression. The proud-looking superintendent, walking out to the gate and glancing at Nekhlyudov's pass in the light of the lantern, shrugged his broad shoulders, but obeyed the order and invited the visitors to follow him. He first led them to the yard, and then to a door on the right hand, and up the stairs leading to the office. Offering them seats, he asked them in what way he could serve them, and learning from Nekhlyudov that he wished to see Maslova, he sent the jailer for her and prepared himself to answer the questions which the Englishman wished to ask him before going to the cell. Nekhlyudov translated the Englishman's questions. While they were conversing, they heard approaching footsteps. The door opened and the jailer entered, followed by Katyusha in her prison garb, with a scarf tied around her head. Nekhlyudov rose and made a few steps toward her. She said nothing, but her excited expression surprised him. Her face was lit up with a wonderful decision. He had never seen her look like that. Now the blood rushed to her face, and now she turned pale. Now her fingers twisted convulsively the edges of her jacket. Now she looked at him, and now she dropped her eyes. "You know what I called you for?" asked Nekhlyudov. "Yes, he told me, but now I am decided. I will ask permission to go with Vladimir Ivanovitch." She said this quickly, as if she had made up her mind before what to say. "How with Vladimir Ivanovitch?" asked Nekhlyudov. But she interrupted him. "But if he wants me to live with him?" Here she stopped in fear and added, "I mean to stay with him. I could expect nothing better, and perhaps I may be useful to him and others. What difference does it make to me?" One of the two things had happened. Either she had fallen in love with Simonson and did not wish his sacrifice, which weighed so heavily on him, or she was still in love with Nekhlyudov and renounced him for his own good, burning all bridges behind her and throwing her fortunes in the same scale with those of Simonson. Nekhlyudov understood it and felt ashamed. "If you are in love with him," he said. "I never knew such people, you know. It is impossible not to love them, and Vladimir is entirely unlike any person I have ever known." "Yes, certainly," said Nekhlyudov. "He is an excellent man, and I think—" Here she interrupted him, as if she were afraid that he would speak too much, or she would not say everything. "You will forgive me for doing that which you did not wish. You too must love." She said the very thing that he had just said to himself. But now he was no longer thinking so, but felt altogether different. He felt not only shame, but pity. "Is it possible that all is at an end between us?" he said. "Yes, it looks like it," she answered, with a strange smile. "But nevertheless, I would like to be useful to you." "To us?" she said, glancing at Nekhlyudov. "We don't need anything. I am very much obliged to you. If it were not for you—" She wished to say something, but her voice began to tremble. "I don't know which of us is under greater obligation to the other. God will settle our accounts," said Nekhlyudov. "Yes, God will settle them," she whispered. "Are you ready?" asked the Englishman. "Directly," answered Nekhlyudov, and then he inquired of her what she knew of Kryltsov. She quieted down and calmly told him. Kryltsov became very weak on the road and was taken to the hospital. Maria Pavlovna wanted to become a nurse, but there is no answer yet. "Well, may I go?" she asked, noticing the Englishman who was waiting for him. "I am not yet taking leave of you," said Nekhlyudov, holding out his hand to her. "Pardon me," she said in a low tone. Their eyes met, and in that strange, stern look, and in that pitiful smile, with which she said not goodbye, but pardon me, Nekhlyudov understood that of the two suppositions concerning her decision, the latter was the right one. She still loved him, and thought she would mar his life by a union with him, and would free him by living with Simonson. She pressed his hand, turned quickly, and left the room. Chapter 91. Passing through the hall and the ill-smelling corridors, the superintendent passed into the first building of the prison, in which those condemned to hard labor were confined. Entering the first room in that building, they found the prisoners stretched on their berths, which occupied the middle of the room. Hearing the visitors enter, they all jumped down, and clinking their chains, placed themselves beside their berths, while their half-shaven heads were distinctly set off against the gloom of the prison. Only two of the prisoners remained at their places. One of them was a young man whose face was evidently heated with fever. The other was an old man who never left off groaning. The Englishman asked whether the young man had been sick for a long time. The superintendent replied that he had been taken sick that very same morning, that the old man had had convulsions for a long time, and that they kept him in prison because there was no place for him in the hospital. The Englishman shook his head discontentedly, said that he would like to say a few words to the prisoners, and asked Nekhlyudov to translate his remarks. It turned out that besides the aim of his journey, which was the description of the exile system, he had another one, the preaching of the gospel, of salvation through faith. "Tell them that Christ pitied and loved them," he said to Nekhlyudov, "and that he died for them. He who will believe in him will be saved." While he was saying this, all the prisoners were standing erect with their hands by their sides. "Tell them," continued the Englishman, "that all I said will be found in this book. Are there any among them who can read?" It turned out that there were more than 20 who could. The Englishman took out a few leather-bound Bibles from his traveling bag, and soon a number of muscular hands, terminating in long black nails, were stretched out toward him, pushing each other aside in order to reach the testaments. He left 2 testaments in this room and went to the next one. There the same thing occurred. There prevailed the same dampness and ill smells. But in this room, between the windows, an image of the Virgin, before which a small lamp burned dimly, was hung up. To the left side of the door stood the large vat. Here the prisoners were stretched out on their berths, and in the same way they rose and placed themselves in a row. 3 of them remained in their places. 2 of these 3 lifted themselves and sat up, but the third one remained stretched out, and did not even look at the visitors. These latter ones were sick. The Englishman addressed them in the same manner, and left 2 testaments. From the cells in which those condemned to hard labor were imprisoned, they passed over to the cells of the exiles, and finally those in which the relatives who escorted the prisoners to Siberia were awaiting the day appointed to start hence. Everywhere the same cold, hungry, idling, sickly, degraded, brutalized human beings could be seen. The Englishman distributed his Bibles, and being tired out, he walked through the rooms saying, "All right," to whatever the superintendent told him concerning the prisons. They went out into the corridor. The Englishman, pointing to an open door, asked what that room was for. "This is the prison morgue." "Oh!" exclaimed the Englishman, and he expressed a desire to enter. This room was an ordinary room. A small lamp, fastened to the wall, lit up the 4 bodies which were stretched on berths, with their heads toward the wall and the feet protruding toward the door. The first body, in a plain shirt, was that of a tall young man, with a small, pointed beard and half-shaven head. The corpse was already chilled, and its blue hands were folded over the breast. Beside him, in a white dress and jacket, lay a barefooted old woman with thin hair and wrinkled, yellowish face. Beside this old woman lay a corpse, attired in blue. This color recalled something in Nekhlyudov's memory. "And who is this third one?" he asked, mistrusting his own eyesight. "This one is a gentleman who was sent hither from the hospital," replied the superintendent. Nekhlyudov walked up to the body and touched the icy cold feet of Kryltsov. Chapter 92. Nekhlyudov, after parting with the Englishman, went straight to his hotel and walked about his room for a long time. The affair with Katyusha was at an end. There was something ugly in the very memory of it, but it was not that which grieved him. Some other affair of his was yet unsettled, an affair which tortured him and required his attention. In his imagination rose the gloomy scenes of the hundreds and thousands of human beings pent up in the pestiferous air. The laughter of the prisoners resounded in his ears. He saw again among the dead bodies the beautiful, angry, waxen face of the dead Kryltsov, and the question whether he was mad, or all those who commit those evils and think themselves wise were mad, bore in upon his mind with renewed power, and he found no answer to it. The principal difficulty consisted in finding an answer to the principal question, which was, what should be done with those who became brutalized in the struggle for life? When he became tired walking about the room, he sat down on the lounge, close by the lamp, and mechanically opened the Bible which the Englishman had presented him, and which he had thrown on the table while emptying his pockets. They say, he thought, that this Bible contains the solution to all questions. So, opening it, he began to read at the place at which it opened itself, Mat. X. 8. After a while he inclined close to the lamp and became like one petrified. An exaltation, the like of which he had not experienced for a long time, took possession of his soul, as though, after long suffering and weariness, he found at last liberty and rest. He did not sleep the whole night. As is the case with many who read the Bible for the first time, he now, on reading it again, grasped the full meaning of words which he had known long ago, but which he had not understood before. Like a sponge that absorbs everything, so he absorbed everything that was important, necessary, and joyful. That is the principal thing, thought Nekhlyudov. We all live in the silly belief that we ourselves are the lords of our world, that this world has been given us for our enjoyment. But this is evidently untrue. Somebody must have sent us here for some reason, and for this reason it is plain that we will suffer like those laborers suffer who do not fulfill the wishes of their master. The will of the Lord is expressed in the teachings of Christ. Let man obey him, and the kingdom of the Lord will come on earth, and man will derive the greatest possible good. Seek the truth and the kingdom of God, and the rest will come of itself. We seek that which is to come, and do not find it. And not only do we not build the kingdom of God, but we destroy it. So this will henceforth be the task of my life. And indeed, from that night, a new life began for Nekhlyudov, not so much because he had risen into a new stage of existence, but because all that had happened to him till then assumed for him an altogether new meaning. The end.